Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. We're on day 3, and this is our final day of just covering the alphabet and pronunciation. Today we have kind of a mixed bag of just minor details, some of which are very important, but they're not really sort of the sweeping issues that we talked about yesterday, for example. So let's dive right in. The first issue is that Russian yeah is never silent. You might want to circle this in the book. Turns out to be one of the most serious problems with just reading Russian for students. And again, their issue really isn't the Russian, it's interference. So the first problem is obviously when we see this letter E, right? It looks exactly like the E we're used to in English. And so we want to either mispronounce it or something or ignore it altogether, right? Because quite often, especially at the end of a word, for example, like in toe or more, right? The E isn't really pronounced per se. It doesn't constitute a syllable. Um, now, for the most part in Russian, you don't have silent letters. We're going to look at a very few exceptions to that rule here in a moment. But just as a general principle, if we're writing it, we're saying it, we're pronouncing a yeah anywhere we're writing that letter. And of course, so that's the first thing. We're always pronouncing it. It's never, ever going to be silent. The second part of that is, of course, remembering that this isn't simply an sound. It's actually the soft yeah. So it begins with that ikratkaya sound, that yeah. Uh, except for when it doesn't, right? We talked about how in borrowed words and after the letter ts, it's pronounced more like but that's kind of a separate issue. Okay, so let's look at a few words here. Look at the word for field and sort of quiz yourself. How is that going to be pronounced? Polya, right? So you might think by analogy to the Russian pole, like the North Pole, that yeah is going to be silent in Russian, but again, that will never happen. So polya, right? The second part there is, of course, noting that it's polya, right? That's a soft a yeah. And here it's also telling us that L is soft as well. Polya, polya. The next one, the word for see, isn't more, right, as you might think, but rather moria, moria. The word for activity, занятие, занятие, soft T, right, soft N as well. And there's a good example in Russian. Another general principle is you're going to have as many syllables as you have vowels, right? Every vowel makes a sound. Every vowel constitutes a syllable. And so занятие, four vowels, a, ya, e, ye, therefore four syllables, four full syllables. So again, be sure to pronounce that yeah fully. Finally, the word for heart is сердце. And there we have an example. After the ts, we're not really saying сердце. We're saying more like ts, simply сердце, сердце. Okay, one place where these final yes come up quite often, and we'll be seeing this here in a couple of days when we start our grammar, is with adjectival endings. So let's compare some adjectives and look at how they're pronounced. These are going to be extremely common, of course. And we don't want to say too much about them right now. We just want to pronounce them basically, but do note that the adjectival endings changed depending on the gender of the word they're modifying, right? Masculine, feminine, or neuter. So let's just read through a few of these and note in particular the neuter forms, which are going to end in a yeah. And again, that yeah is never going to be silent. So new, новый, новая, новая. Or yeah on that ending. Old will be старый, старая, старая. Note that because of vowel reduction, right, the feminine and the neuter version sounds almost the same. It can be almost hard to hear that difference in speech. Okay, good. Хороший, хорошая, хорошая. Bad. Плохой, плохая, плохое. Big. Большой, большая, большое. Small. Маленький, маленькая, маленькая. Boring, скучный, скучная, скучная. Okay, easy, легкий, легкая, легкая. Okay, you may have noticed in those last two examples something kind of funny going on. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Okay, let's think about the Russian "ye" at the beginning of words. Again, the same issue really, but when students see this at the beginning of a word, they often, again, they think English or e or whatever, and they forget that this is "ye," right? This is the soft vowel. This starts with the "y" sound. So let's practice examples. Еще, еще, right? Note the "y" sound at the beginning. Еда, еда, yosh, there's a your, right, example, same idea. And finally, examen. Okay, now there is that's indeed, so there that word does begin with because that's as opposed to the soft version, yeah. Okay, let's look at some more, again, very isolated examples here. Just to point out that sometimes it will occur that Russian will not pronounce a given letter, but that's really very, very unusual. So these are really just a few common examples, and it's really hard to think of a whole lot of others. So let's start off with the word we should learn, and we'll be practicing it here in the coming days. Здравствуйте. Note the spelling there. It's actually zdrav, zdravствуйте. But the v is not pronounced, right? It just drops out because it's hard to pronounce. This word is not very easy to pronounce generally. So what we actually say is здравствуйте, здравствуйте, with no v. Similarly, the word for feeling is чувство, чувство, not чувство. The word for sun, the L drops out, so солнце, солнце. The word for happy is счастливый, счастливый. The T drops out. Поздно, поздно. The D is dropped out. And finally, here is another very common word that we'll be practicing right off the bat. Пожалуйста, пожалуйста. Now there are two letters really have dropped out. It's not пожалуйста as it's written, but пожалуйста, пожалуйста. Okay, sometimes certain consonants sound like others. As, for example, let's take the combination we mentioned the other day, S, ch. That's pronounced like sh, right? That double length consonant. So again, this is fairly limited. We're not seeing this combination just constantly, but here are a few fairly common words. Счастье, счастье, счастливый, счастливый. And finally, short, short. Okay, two very common words. As we mentioned the other day, the ch sounds more like a sh typically. So the word for what is что, что. And of course is конечно, конечно. Okay, we'll be hearing both of those words a lot. Finally, again, fairly unusual, a g is sort of historically that would be devoiced, or it could be devoiced not to a ka as it is in modern Russian, but to a ch or something like that. So in Slavic, you have sometimes different versions of devoicings and things like this. So this is sort of a vestige of something that's not really very Russian, at least not in the modern understanding of it, the way devoicing works. Okay, so in the first two examples here, we had this happening in a cluster, right? We have a g followed by a ka. Ka is not voiced, so we have assimilation. And anyway, the long and short of it is we end up with легкий, легкий, right? And similarly with soft, мягкий, легкий, мягкий. And finally, the word for God, there we have the final g that's being devoiced instead of to bork, rather to borch, borch. Okay, so those are, again, fairly limited little examples. And you see today we're kind of just looking at some little details. Here's another issue that's kind of interesting. Some Slavic languages have what's called a syllabic L or a syllabic R, which basically means that in Czech, for example, you can simply write an R, but that won't represent just the consonant R. It will represent a sound like or ul or something like this. It'll have kind of a vowel baked into it. And we call that a syllabic L, for example, because the letter L, which is normally a consonant, of course, can represent a vowel plus a consonant. Okay, so on the one hand, Russian doesn't really have that. At least they don't think of it that way. But in terms of how they actually pronounce certain R's and L's in certain positions, and even in M, we have the same kind of thing going on. So this isn't normally presented as like a feature of the language or the spelling system or something, but nevertheless, we do kind of deal with it. So let's look at a few examples. For example, a final R, like in the word for theater, 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 right? And you see that. Well, let's look at it this way. How many syllables is that? Well, if you ask a Russian, they're usually going to count the vowels, as we just learned, right? We have a yeah, we have an ah, two vowels, therefore two syllables. And so, for example, if this word were being used in poetry, where poetic meter is, very important, and the syllables are counted very strictly, we would indeed say that this is a two-syllable word, right? But if we're listening to what people actually say, that isn't always the case, right? Because they don't always say théâtre, théâtre, where it's really almost truly two syllables. It's usually something more like théâtre, théâtre. Okay, really, you've got three syllables there. In all honesty, it's kind of an interesting thing. I've kind of this has come up with some native speakers of Russian, and I don't think they really sometimes even hear this because again, they're taught not to think of having these not to think that that's a syllable basically. But again, it can be. Okay, so look at more examples. Ruble, ruble. Okay, again, it kind of depends on how you say it, how emphatically you say it. But if we're being strict, we would say that's one syllable. Indeed, we would say that again, especially if it were in a poem or something. Ruble, ruble. But almost inevitably, you're getting you're getting a little vowel intruding on that L. Ruble, ruble. Okay, similarly, here with an N, жизнь, жизнь. Okay, how many syllables? Well, we usually say one. We have only one vowel. But again, жизнь, жизнь. Kind of sounds like two sometimes. Semester, semester. Again, a final R. Kreml, Kreml. Again, a final L. And here's an example with an M, actually, communism, communism. Okay, how many syllables? O, U, E, right? Three vowels. Therefore, we would say this is a three-syllable word in Russian, but we still have this kind of extra syllable popping up at the end sometimes. Communism, communism. Okay, so something to listen for and think about, but ultimately not that big of a deal. Okay, let's look at some consonant clusters. Now, this also isn't really a problem. Some languages, Georgian is notorious for this, have crazy consonant clusters. Russian really doesn't have these in any really problematic way. Sometimes they just may strike English speakers as a little bit weird, but they're not really hard to pronounce necessarily. Here, the first word, bird, is a good example. Ptitsa, ptitsa, right? Not a combination we're used to making, P with T. And so you might have the urge to break that up somehow and say something like petitsa, petitsa, because you're not used to making petitsa, petitsa. Again, how many syllables there? Well, two vowels, ergo two syllables. Petitsa. Okay, so I think anyone with just a little practice, they can say that. It's not really that difficult. The next one, here we have a three consonant cluster, mgla, mgla. Okay, that's maybe a little bit harder, but I think also not really that challenging. Tsma, tsma. That one's interesting because we have a soft T followed by an M. So really just a two consonant cluster, but the first consonant is soft, and that maybe is a bit tricky. Ts, ts, Sma. Okay, here's this example for gaze is maybe about as bad as Russian gets in terms of consonant clusters. Взгляд. Взгляд. Sorry, I mispronounced it a bit. Взгляд. Взгляд. Okay, how many consonants there? V, Z, G, L, and actually Y, right? If we count the Y sound we get with ya, we have maybe as many as five consonants there. Now keep in mind, of course, that the ya is marking the L as soft. So the word is взгляд, взгляд. Okay, that one's pretty tricky, but again, that's about as bad as it gets in Russian. Ткань, ткань. Again, kind of unusual. Of course, a lot of these words we're not going to be using very much here initially. And here's a funny one. Rtuć, rtuć, mercury. Okay, next, here's an issue that comes up over and over again. Students keep asking about it, and it is a little bit weird. But I think the trick here is to keep in mind, again, that generally Russian writes, it spells words in a meaningful way, right? There aren't often letters that are there just for no reason. We've seen a couple of examples of that, but for the most part, that doesn't happen. And so look at these words. You see that they all end with a consonant followed by a soft sign, followed by a soft vowel. Okay, so the question here is, students think, well, look at the word for joy, счастье, right? If we have that final ye, which is a soft vowel, that's going to tell us that the te in front of it is soft. So what do we need a soft sign for, right? They're wondering, why do we write a soft sign here when the soft sign is superfluous, right? It's not needed to show that we have a soft T. Well, that's the thing. It's not superfluous. Okay, so if we break this down a bit, hopefully you'll see what's going on. And again, really try to notice what's happening because, again, this question just keeps coming up over and over again. What we have is счастье, right? Soft T, and that's shown by the soft sign, right? Te, soft sign, is showing us that we have a soft T. That soft T in turn is followed by a full soft vowel, yeah, right? So this is actually not the same as if we simply wrote счастье with te followed immediately by a soft yeah, tsie, tsie. Instead we have yeah, tsie, tsie. Okay, so I think there are two things here. The first is simply to notice what's going on with the spelling and to notice that indeed the soft sign is needed here. It's another matter to pronounce this correctly, and especially at this stage, right? We're on day 3. This is kind of a tall order. The trick is to give yourself some breathing room in between the soft T, for example, that final soft consonant, kind of pronounce that, then sort of regroup, so to speak, pause, and then pronounce a full yeah or ya. Okay, so let's practice that, for example. Счастье, 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 right? Soft T, and then follow that with a full yeah. Счастье, счастье, счастье. Okay, and then as you work on it, you want to eliminate that pause, right? Try to eliminate that gap as much as possible. Now, if Russian were speaking normally, this is hard to hear, especially for a beginning student, but you can hear it, right? So this distinction, again, is made not only in writing, but in speech. Although, of course, if a Russian is speaking at normal speed, it can be very difficult to hear this distinction. But it does exist, it is there. But again, this will take time to pick up on. Okay, let's look at a few more examples and pronounce them very, very slowly, very carefully. The word for dress, платье, платье, платье. Okay, family is семья, семья, семья. Article, стать, статья, статья, статья. Bench, скамь, скамья, скамья. Okay, so we'll practice that more later. Okay, let's go through, now that we've been through all of these points with pronunciation, let's simply run through the nouns in this chapter's vocab. By the way, the vocab for each chapter is in a table at the end of the chapter. If you can find that and start drilling it and working on learning the vocab. So let's just read out these nouns and again, let's try to put everything together. Notice everything that's going on with the words. Watch for vowel reduction. Remember, just because we see an R and an O on the page doesn't mean we're actually pronouncing them as A or O. We've got consonant devoicing. We've got hard versus soft consonants, all of this stuff going on. Okay, so let's go through the list. Repeat after me. Книга, комната, одежда, работа, картина, проблема, задача, ручка, лампа, рубашка, футболка, этажерка, машина, передача, ошибка, страница, газета, сумка, тема. Now we have some soft feminine nouns. I forgot to mention all the nouns we just looked at are feminine. We're going to talk about that later. That's not really the point of today's lesson, but just notice that all of those nouns in that first group ended in a, those are hard feminine nouns. What do we mean by hard? Well, they have hard endings. Note that all those ahs, they're marking the preceding consonant as hard consonants. Those are hard endings, therefore hard feminine nouns. Now compare those to soft feminine nouns. Those are going to end in ya. So you see already, we mentioned the other day how important this hard-soft distinction is. Every noun is either hard or soft, and that's going to affect the endings we add to it. So for now, let's just pronounce. Идея, неделя, простыня, простыня, статья, фотография, история, familia, семья. Now come neuters. Hard neuters end in o, soft neuters end in ye, sometimes yo. Okay, so you see again, very consistent. O is a so-called hard vowel. Ye and yo, we called those soft vowels. Дело, окно, место, зеркало, кресло, письмо, одеяло, мыло, right? Мыло, утро, пальто, right? Пальто, кино, имя. By the way, Kino happens to be the name of a band whose very well-known frontman, Victor Tsoi. He had this group Kino. They were one of the major late Soviet rock bands. So if you look at on the website under the Soviet rock blog, you can find a lot of songs by Kino. And listening to music is a great way to practice your pronunciation and your Russian generally. So anyway, great classic Russian band Kino. Okay, let's look at some soft neuters. I think I left out a noun there. Имя. Имя, that's a neuter, despite the fact that it ends in ya. That's a weird type of noun. That we won't be seeing many of those for now. Soft neuters. Платье, полотенце, белье, расписание, упражнение, задание. Finally, masculine nouns have no ending, strictly speaking, or we could say that they end in consonants. but they don't have an ending like a or something. Okay, so note here that we have hard masculines ending in a hard consonant, and we have some soft masculines ending in either a soft sign or yeah, right? Which, as we know, ikratke, I should say, ikratke, which, as we know, is a soft. It's associated with softness, and we would say it's a soft consonant. Stol, stool, velocipede, telefoon, computer, televisor, plakat, карандаш, рюкзак, ковер, мяч, ключ, вечер, зонт, сериал, фильм, журнал, вопрос, ответ, кошелек. Finally, some soft ones. Shampooing. Okay, there's a good example, right? Hard versus soft. It's not shampoon, but shampooing, shampooing. Словарь, день, музей, кафетерий. Now, I've put that word in here. This is, you'll understand why I did this later. There's a much more common word for sort of a cafeteria style eating establishment, and that is stalovaya. Stalovaya, which is actually a feminine noun. And we'll be seeing that later, but I've thrown in this word cafetieri because it represents a type, a certain type of noun that's really quite uncommon in Russian. So it's kind of hard to think of everyday examples, but I wanted to throw out at least one of them so that we can, a little bit down the road, see how those nouns decline. That is, what endings they take. Okay, let's look at some of the chapter's adjectives in all three grammatical genders. And again, watch for the endings and don't pronounce a yeah as a silent E. Новый, новая, новая. Старый, старая, старая. Чистый, чистая, чистая. Грязный, грязная, грязная. Дорогой, дорогая, дорогое. Дешевый, дешевая, дешевая. Трудный, трудная, трудная. Here we have the ge becoming a ch, right, with this word for easy or light. Легкий, легкая, легкая. Плохой, плохая, плохое. Хороший, хорошая, хорошая. Большой, большая, большое. Маленький. Note that soft N. Now, again, we mentioned how that can be a little bit inconspicuous there when it's buried in the middle of a word. But ideally, we should be saying malin, malin, маленький, маленький, маленькая, маленькая. Важный, важная, важная. Любимый, любимая, любимая. Sorry, любимая. I bungled that ending there. Ужасный, ужасная, ужасная. Русский, русская, русская. Actually, the mistake I just made brought something rather important to mind. Sometimes in class, I may do this, and I noticed a lot when I studied in Russia that Russian instructors would do this quite often. They'll pronounce a word as written in order for you to understand how it's spelled, right? That is, they'll pronounce a word with no vowel reduction. So, for example, if I say, look at the feminine and neuter examples for horrible, ужасная, ужасная, right? Because of the reduction, they sound almost indistinguishable, right? But if I say ужасная versus ужасное, then it's perfectly clear what we're writing, right? And the difference is very clear. So that's something to listen for in class, right? Just pronouncing a word with no reduction on purpose, just to be clear about the spelling, right? But of course, no Russian would say it that way in normal speech. Okay, finally, here's the alphabet presented in order, right? We haven't really done that yet, but here it is finally. And we have the printed versions, the cursive versions, which we'll be learning tomorrow. By the way, italic forms of these letters often resemble their cursive versions, and the way we say the letters, right? So I'll run through that list quickly here. A, B, V, G, D, Е, Ё, Ж, Z, И, И краткое. Remember that's the short E, literally, and it's the one with the little hat on it. That's the consonant. И краткое. K, L, M, N, O, P, R, S, T, U, F. Sometimes you hear F with that one, and you can hear both. Ch, C, Ch, Sha, Sha. And now we have the hard sign, which of course we can't pronounce that all by itself, right? So we simply call that tвердый знак, hard sign. Y. And then the soft sign. Again, we can't pronounce it by itself. It has no sound of its own. So we call that мягкий знак, soft sign. Now compare those three letters. It can be a little bit easy to confuse those visually. Hard sign, y, soft sign. Remember that the hard sign is relatively rare. Okay, and finally, U, ya. Okay, so that does it for our coverage of pronunciation. On day 4, we're going to learn how to write Russian the way Russians normally do, using cursive. And so that's a really important skill to learn. And then on day 5, we'll start our grammar. Anyway, until tomorrow, до свидания, товарищи.